Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this opportunity to come before you on this very important subject. Name is Dwight Evans, Congressman of the 2nd Congressional District. What I'd like to do is thank you, Chairman, for convening this very important hearing on housing and banking lending practices. Those discriminatory practices are happening in Philadelphia, frankly, and around the nation. This morning, I'd like to provide you some insight from a federal perspective on what the problem is and how we can fix it. Unfortunately, if you look at the problem of predatory lending in urban areas across the nation, you can draw a straight line from the 1950s as America began to integrate to the modern day problems of redlining, predatory lending, and other harmful banking practices that have a disproportionate impact on blacks and other minorities. I don't have to tell you that this is a big problem in our city, as renters make up 50% of our households according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Yes, there are people who cannot afford to buy and simply rent, but there's another class of people who can fully afford to buy and are held back by redlining, high interest rates, and unfair rules. Predatory loans are those that are not based on the borrower's ability to repay the loan, but more on their equity in the market. Some examples of predatory lending include loan flipping, equity skimming, bait and switch tactics, and charge servicer. Credit insurance packaging. At the federal level, the Congressional Black Caucus has produced a document which I recommend entitled, "We Have a Lot to Lose." You may recall in this city, the president came here and gave his speech, and specifically targeting the African American community when he said, "What the hell do you have to lose?" Which you may recall, we responded, "We have a lot to lose. We have advanced solutions in the 21st century for the black community." Our answer was then and now that we are facing up to the fight. Based on that, in my experience, I offered a few ideas. Build strength, middle neighborhoods, which you know I have an awful lot of experience with, Mr. Chairman, because in the neighborhood that I built, fundamentally, I demonstrated to people that you could do things in West Oak Lane, Mount Airy, Roxborough, Winfield, Overbrook, and all of those communities, which are vulnerable to decline without a comprehensive approach to affordable housing. Support the Community Development Finance Fund, the CDFIs, which support housing and other activities in low-income communities. When we invest in CDFIs, we are making a commitment to improve capital access and promote greater economic activity. If you allow me, Mr. Chairman, I want to take a few minutes, because when I had a conversation with you offline, that was prior to the budget settlement that we did in Washington. And I don't want you to take that budget settlement lightly, because that budget settlement, even though people have a way of focusing on the president, that budget settlement was a huge housing boom. For example, Community Development Block Grant, $300 million new and additional dollars. Now that's not as much, I don't want you to get excited, Mr. Chairman, you think that $300 million is coming directly to your district, but that's across the entire country. I've had a conversation with Mr. Engler from the mayor's office, and we've talked about that. CDFIs, we increased CDFIs. There's been an increase in that. There's been an increase in the homes program. So in other words, as I listen to your testimony, Mr. Speaker, we have in the budget, passed the budget for the first time that people can document and see that there's an increase in housing. So we need to be clear that there's resources, and I've heard you talk about the resources, but it's now there's resources available, and how you and this body decides in the priorities that, at least from the federal perspective, is moving in the right direction. We work to strengthen the new market tax credit. That is also an area that has been. PHFI, Pennsylvania Housing Finance, will also be able to do more. So if you take that combination with PHFA will do, with CDFI, we can move some direction. Expand use of the low-income housing tax credit, which has helped housing to low-income families in Philadelphia, in effect, brought capital to underserved regions. require the office of the controller of the currency, which is part of the Treasury Department, to conditions for fintech charter confirmation on applications demonstrated with compliance in truth and lending, which is also something very important. The block grant I just described to you about the increase in block grant, that hasn't happened in almost 10 years. But I want you to understand this. That was a collective effort by all of the members in the Democratic caucus. I throw a little politics into you with the collective leadership of Nancy Pelosi, who also voted for, and all the members of the Congressional Black Caucus. It was that leverage, not so much because of the Trump administration, because those of us recognize urban America has a seat at this table. So I stress that to you. Mr. Chairman, I want to express to you today that this hearing is just the beginning. I'm not saying to you that there's not a lot more work to do, but we have to continue with this. And finally, let me give you an example of what we are up against in Washington with GPO control. While we should go out and vote in every election, every week that we're in Washington, when we called in session, the Financial Service Committee, which has oversight by Ranking Member Maxine Waters, basically, fundamentally, is fighting the idea of not moving in the opposite direction on the Dodd-Frank. You mentioned that when it comes down to it, that they are trying to move in the wrong direction. Maxine Waters, who's from California, fights very diligently on the element of not moving in that direction. So I will quickly analyze one of those, House R 4545, a bill that I voted against. The bill supporters say that this gave the banks and other financial institutions a right to appeal adverse findings by regulators, that in reality is thinly veiled attempt to avoid the law put in place to force banks to be accountable to their borrowers. The reality is that as long as the GOP controls, we have to deal with these bills like this with well-funded Wall Street supporters. I promise you to continue to fight to increase access to affordable housing, fight predatory lending, and promote economic development in the Commonwealth and our great city. So I say to you, Mr. Chairman, by you conducting this hearing, you are the first responders. You're on the ground level. You're providing information. You're dealing in the day-to-day. You're correct. In the district that I represent, poverty is at 26%. 195,000 people are in poverty. West Philly particularly has more poverty than any other section in this particular district. We're trying to work on that in terms of support of the promise. So I think with your hearing, working with the Attorney General who is here, and the things that we're doing, that the state of, that we can put a coalition together that's functioning. It's not going to happen overnight. So I want to tell anybody there's going to be a magic answer to it, but I believe that we are moving in the right direction. I think that's important by what you're doing here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
State your name and position for the record, please.
My name is Josh Shapiro. I'm the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it's good to be here with my friend Congressman, or Chairman Evans, always chairman to me, and of course my former colleagues, Kenyatta Johnson, Sherelle Parker, and Councilwoman Brown. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for hosting this important hearing. I can't recall, as Attorney General, ever testifying before this body, and in fact, very rarely testify in public session about the work we're doing. But I'm here today because of the importance of this issue of redlining, and I think the importance of speaking out on it and appreciating the fact that this body is highlighting the issue. And I'm glad to have that opportunity to talk with you today. I think we're all aware that earlier this week, Linda Brown, the plaintiff in Brown versus Board of Education, passed away. Brown stated in a nutshell that we must desegregate with all deliberate speed. But I think it's clear, while that represented real progress, Brown did not end racial segregation by any means. It did, in fact, establish a legal framework to move closer to the notion that all, and I'm going to say persons, but it said men, that all persons are created equal. Now, in this country, we have a very sad history of redlining. It began in earnest in the 1930s. It was part of the Jim Crow laws. Banks essentially wanted to know which neighborhoods were safe, quote unquote, safe to invest in. And so what they did was they drew red lines, literal red lines, around undesirable neighborhoods in their minds. Usually, these neighborhoods corresponded with areas where there were large minority or immigrant neighborhoods. These results were really devastating to families and communities. Families fell into poverty, and communities, many of them, fell into disrepair. Property values plummeted, local businesses closed, landlords abandoned properties, and some became locations for drug dealing and other crimes. The civil rights movement then helped us make additional progress, and redlining actually became illegal under the 1968 Fair Housing Act. But I would submit to you and to the members of this committee, Mr. Chairman, that it is still a real problem in many communities across this country. The question is whether or not it is a problem here in the city of Philadelphia, and that is a question I'm determined to answer. Recently, there was an investigation by Reveal magazine. They looked at 61 metro areas across the country, but focused a lot of their attention on the city of Philadelphia, where discrimination is most prevalent. The findings in this Reveal magazine were quite troubling. African Americans were 2.7 times more likely to be denied a home mortgage in Philadelphia as compared to whites. White applicants received 10 times as many loans as black applicants, even though they made up similar proportions of the population. And several major banks were highlighted in this story having high variance in lending. Let me provide one example. Wells Fargo denied 27% of African American applicants, and yet only 9% of white applicants. Other banks were highlighted as well, and I think it's important to note for the record, at least one of those banks, PNC, did submit to me in writing some additional data that they asked me to consider. While not necessarily all evidence of discrimination, I would submit to you that this data raises some clear red flags. I would also note that the Community Reinvestment Act, something I hope we'll get into during our discussion here today, and certainly something Congressman Evans is familiar with, only applies to financial institutions that take deposits, like Wells Fargo, for example. It does not apply to some of these mortgage companies that you might find online or other mortgage companies that don't take deposits, leaving us with the inability to gather certain kinds of data from certain lenders. I believe fundamentally that we must root out all discrimination, whether it's racial, ethnic, gender-based, religion-based, or based on someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And we work to do that each and every day in the Office of Attorney General, as you know. But as you dig deeper into this data, one of the things that is often relied upon when making these decisions as it relates to housing are credit scores. And so I want to just take a moment and highlight that. And again, Mr. Chairman, you have my full written testimony. I just wanted to share a few thoughts with you here today. Lenders claim that credit scores are the real reason for the disparity that I cited before and that is cited extensively in Reveal magazine. Credit scores, as you know, are three-digit numbers that indicate a reliability for loans, reliability to pay those loans back. I am concerned really fundamentally about the over-reliance on credit scores for basically three reasons. Number one, the formulas for how these credit scores are created are not public. There is virtually no transparency surrounding these credit score process. Number two, these credit scores are controlled by for-profit agencies. As you know, we're leading the national investigation into Equifax after they lost the data of 160 million Americans, including 5.6 million Pennsylvanians. I don't think they're a particularly reliable source of information if they can't just simply keep their computers locked down properly. And third, these credit scores can be used as a simple proxy to discriminate. And then what that does is it proliferates a system of systemic racism in this country. So I'm deeply concerned about the over-reliance on credit scores, and I would hope that that would be something this committee would focus on. 2007 Federal Reserve report actually noted this fact, and I would quote that on average, Blacks and Hispanics have lower credit scores than non-Hispanic whites and Asians, according to this report. So if we're over-relying on credit scores, it's no wonder that certain people are being left out of the opportunity for progress. Overall, when certain Philadelphians are denied loans because of systemic racism, that not only holds that individual back, but it holds the whole family back. It holds a neighborhood back, and it holds an entire city back. It doesn't allow people to have the progress that they've worked hard for and that they've earned. And Councilwoman Parker and I were talking about this issue just the other day as it relates to her district. I also think it's an issue of fundamental fairness. You know, we work hard every day in the Office of Attorney General to make sure folks know, whether they like the decisions we make or don't, make sure they know that we're making these decisions based on fairness. Every institution should be held to that standard, and any hint that there is discrimination based on an applicant's ethnicity or skin color goes to the heart of the fundamental fairness question and inequities that exist in our system. I want to state very clearly, redlining is wrong, it is against the law, and I will not allow it to stand here in the city of Philadelphia or anywhere in Pennsylvania. And that is why I've launched an investigation into this matter, based in part on the reporting from Reveal, based in part on Senator Vincent Hughes reaching out on the issue, and of course based in part on the good members of this committee, yourself, Mr. Chairman, Councilwoman Parker, Councilwoman Reynolds Brown, raising this issue with me and saying, you got to dig in on it. And while I'm not going to comment specifically on how our investigation is going, let me just tell you some of the steps I've taken so far, because I do think it's important to be as transparent as we can in this investigation. I've directed my Bureau of Consumer Protection and my Bureau of Civil Rights to determine first whether we have jurisdiction, and I can report to this committee that we do in fact have jurisdiction. Second, we've reached out to leaders in minority communities here in Philadelphia to help identify experts, help us understand the industry better, and help us determine if there is evidence of discrimination. And that process is ongoing and going quite well. Third, we have interviewed consumer advocates who are on the front lines, who deal with these complaints every day, and I would submit to you, I presume your offices have received phone calls as well, and so we're trying to hear from folks who have heard from people in the community. We've partnered with the Pennsylvania Human Rights Commission and other government agencies who are working with us on this investigation. Obviously, beyond that, I really can't comment any further. The last thing I'll say is this. We need residents of the city of Philadelphia to help us with this. We want to hear from them. We have a special hotline set up where people can contact us with either examples of redlining or other things related that they're concerned about. Folks can call 1-800-441-2555. If you prefer not to call, we set up a special email hotline. Very simple. It's discrimination@attorneygeneral.gov. Again, discrimination@attorneygeneral.gov. And we have a special section on our website, www.attorneygeneral.gov/discrimination. It is really important for us to hear from the public. And I'll look forward to it, Mr. Chairman, at your invitation, coming back and reporting on the outcome of our investigation when it is complete. But again, just in closing, I want to thank you for your interest in this issue. Appreciate the fact that you're highlighting it. When you look at many of the challenges that we face in our criminal justice system, I can draw a direct line in communities where there are high incidents of crime to communities where there are not economic opportunities, where there is not stable housing, where there are not adequate educational opportunities for our young people. And so you can help us reduce crime in the city of Philadelphia. You can help us do our job to make people safe by addressing this issue of housing in the city of Philadelphia. And I applaud you for your willingness to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman Kenyatta Johnson, members of the Council Committee on Legislative Oversight.
Can you state your name and title for the record, please?
Thank you for the invitation. I am the Sussman Professor of Real Estate and Professor of Finance at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Susan Wachter. I am also former Assistant Secretary for Housing under President Clinton, and in that office I had the pleasure of helping to develop the New Market Tax Credit that was referenced by the Honorable Congressman. Again, thank you for the invitation to testify at today's hearings on racial disparities in home lending. Together with co-authors, I have written scholarly papers on redlining and the housing finance system. It is an honor to testify today with the Congressman and with the Attorney General. Recent research has shown the persistent outcomes of racial discrimination in mortgage lending. In particular, historical lending practices institutionalized by the FHA reinforced economic segregation in America's cities. Loans in redlined areas were severely restricted, in some cases entirely unavailable, resulting in a feedback loop in which low-income and minority households became increasingly disadvantaged in the lending market and unable to fairly advance their economic standing. Although the 1968 Fair Housing Act, whose 50-year anniversary we are celebrating a week from today, is aimed to prevent and reverse the unjust social and economic impacts of redlining, the legacy of past practices remain visible today. Physical and economic rifts continue to exist based on past lending accessibility, which spurred a cycle of disinvestment with long-lasting impacts for urban areas. Today's mortgage lending practices also result in differential access to credit by geography. The REVEAL study that has referenced earlier shows that Philadelphia is one of the largest cities in America with disproportionate lending outcomes for minorities today. The study shows that while there were over 15,000 home purchase loans, conventional home purchase loans, originated in the city in 2015 and 2016, minority groups only accounted for 3,000 of those 15,000 loans. This hearing is about mortgage lending practices in Philadelphia now and the ongoing impact they will inevitably have. We know how deleterious such lending practices can be to undermining the potential of neighborhood development. We also know that they limit access to homeownership, the best method to advance families' well-being and welfare. Neighborhood redlining can result from creditors' reliance in the underwriting process on perceived risks, misperceived risks in neighborhoods, which then results in a self-fulfilling prophecy that actually raises the risk of lending in such neighborhoods. Similarly, mortgage lending limits can limit and constrain home sales, with the result that there are fewer transactions in neighborhoods to inform future lending. The lack of lending itself chills investment and the opportunity for home ownership in such neighborhoods. The question before this hearing is a critical one. As the Community Reinvestment Act, which was put into place to prevent the harmful lending practices of the past and has worked to spur community reinvestment, is now in the process of being revised. Understanding the sources of today's lending disparities is necessary to inform the correct re-envisioning of the CRA and its strengthening rather than its weakening. Among other factors, the impact of higher credit scores, which has been referenced by the Attorney General, needs to be further explored and identified. We know that higher required credit scores are part of the reason for the so-called tighter lending box and the resulting lower homeownership rates for first-time home buyers, particularly minorities, which is at an all-time low. Other factors may also be important, such as the so-called appraisal gap, which discourages lending to properties in need of renovation. Identifying the sources of disparities in lending will be critical for re-envisioning community lending and community reinvestment going forward, as well as providing opportunity for safe and fair access to homeownership going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just also want to state for the record, Attorney General Shapiro talked about the work he's doing with Senator Vincent Hughes, and he recently, this week, introduced on the state level the Pennsylvania Community Reinvestment Act to begin on a state level trying to come up with some of the safeguards that was similarly mentioned that we have to address on the federal level. I just want to go back just real quick to our Congressman, just on the federal level, just for you just to so much clarify and just reinstate the fact that now, I know you're against the exemptions under this Dodd-Frank Act that they're trying to roll back, as well as that's the Congressional Black Caucus as a whole, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And hopefully, on the Credit Score Competition Act, there will be the same type of mobilization and advocacy around alternative credit scores that also goes into how we address this issue of redlining, correct?
Correct. Mr. Chairman, I thought the Attorney General did a very good job in articulating the aspect of the rules of the game, right? Because obviously the rules can impede economic opportunity. And as the professor talked about with redlining, there's a certain aspect affected called opportunity cost. And what the professor was referring to when she talks about just the aspect of redlining and the threat, it affects opportunity costs, which in return affects economic opportunity, right? Investments in these communities. But what I was attempting to share with you is although we're fighting the battle on the content relating to the rules, the financing that comes to the city and the priorities that you set are very essential in terms of your block grant, how you deal with the block grant. As was described that council, and I give y'all credit for what you did with the realtor transfer tax, in using that method, basically because the concern is the order of the distribution. So by adding the block grant, the question is how we face up to it. But I think what's most important about this hearing that you're attempting to do is this will only happen unless there's a functional coalition brought together. The locals, as you described, with the state and the feds. To my knowledge, and I've been around here a little while, I don't think I've ever seen this before, where you have the sitting attorney general with under your leadership and the academic here who also worked in the federal government and the things that she has said. So I think that we're poised in this city and in the state to move in the right direction. Now, I know that doesn't mean to people who are listening to this about who need access to capital. I sit on the Small Business Committee. I'm the ranking member on economic growth. And we talk about capital a lot for businesses. It's the same thing. We talk just with the Attorney General. So I guess what I'm saying to you, to me, with your leadership as chairman of this committee, you are the conductor. Really, it's the locals who do the implementing. You don't do it at the federal level, and I know, as I recall, you don't do it at the state level. You, as council people, are the front line. You're the ones who are most responsible for implementing. The feds, we do what we do, but the people come in contact mostly with you than they do with myself. So I share with you that this hearing, I just want to compliment the fact of the way you're conducting this hearing and the direction you're moving.
Thank you. Councilman Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me say welcome to each of you. We appreciate you being before the committee today. I want to start with you, Attorney General Shapiro, because the context with which you proffered your testimony, particularly opening up relative to Ms. Brown. And you put it in the context of civil rights, and you talked about the solutions relative to the investigation that your office is conducting, but you noted that both divisions, not just consumer protection, but also civil rights. You have both of those divisions within the Attorney General's office working on this issue. It is with this in mind that I want to note for the record that for a very long time we considered simply gaining access to equitable opportunities to receive a quality education as the singular civil rights issue of the 21st century.
Right.
The manner with which you have just described how your department is using the powers within your disposal to investigate this issue with the hopes of coming up with solutions, you have just identified for us that equitable access to the capital needed to pursue the American dream is also one of the key civil rights issues of the 21st century. My question to you is, since you're the Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and I know you can't talk about the investigation in detail, but I know people usually use race as the most emotionally charged element to divide residents in our Commonwealth. But if we were gambling, I would dare say to you that if this investigation included those who were living in poverty in rural Pennsylvania, that there would be a direct correlation not only as it relates to race, but socioeconomic status. And my ask of you is, in your work with State Senator Vincent Hughes, are we in any way, shape, or form trying to connect this issue not only from an urban perspective, but seeing how it impacts Pennsylvanians who are living in rural Pennsylvania? Because now I'm thinking about our few years of experience in Harrisburg, that if rural legislators also understand that this is impacting their constituency, we could potentially pick up some allies in helping to come up with the state version of a solution to this. So tell me, is it at all possible, or will we be looking at rural communities also?
I appreciate your question and your comments and of course your leadership. And just to react to the opening part of what you said there, I mean, we have a saying in our office that we talk about each and every day, that we want fairness in our justice system, and most importantly, that we want to apply the law without fear and without favor, and that everyone should be equal under the eyes of the law. And I think you can extrapolate that everyone should have equal opportunity. It doesn't mean that everyone will end up exactly equal in terms of what they earn or where they go to school or what have you. But everybody should have that opportunity. And for too many communities in Pennsylvania, that opportunity is taken away from them and predetermined because of where they live, what they look like, maybe who they love or where they're from. And we work every day to take those factors out of the discussion and give people an equal opportunity. Now, you raise a really important point, I think, given your understanding of how this state works from your previous life in Harrisburg. It's all about building a coalition in order to help deal with a problem. And the reality is, as much as you're going to do here in the city of Philadelphia, which is going to be incredibly helpful, we should have a statewide and indeed a federal answer to this question. And I think you raise a great point. When you study rural poverty and urban poverty, there are so many similarities in that. While the people may look different, and the terrain may quite literally look different, when you study some of the key effects of it, they're really all the same. Let me give you a few examples. We lack educational opportunities in some zip codes in Philadelphia, just as we do some zip codes in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where people look a whole lot different than they do in North Philly, for example. But the effects are the same. When students don't have the chance to learn, when students don't have access to the same things that you or I did growing up, they're destined to have a much harder time to be able to succeed. A second example of that is economic opportunity, and housing obviously flows from that. if you don't have access to a good job, if you don't have access to capital, if the banks or some other institution are closing the door on you before you even show up, then we know you're going to be destined to fail in that process. And finally, and I know we're not here to talk about the heroin and opioid epidemic, but you know that's my top priority in terms of the need to save lives. We're losing 15 Pennsylvanians a day, 1,200 Philadelphians last year. If you go and study the heroin and opioid crisis in Pennsylvania, we've lost way more lives in the city of Philadelphia than any other community. But if you stack up each of Pennsylvania's 67 counties in terms of the percentage increase in overdose deaths, the top 18 counties are all rural counties. And I would submit to you probably rural counties that are very white counties and look very different than the city of Philadelphia. And a big part of that is because of the impact poverty has on people who then fall susceptible to some of the challenges that are posed by this crisis, whether it's the pharmaceutical drugs that are being flooded into these communities, the prevalence of cheap heroin, whatever the case may be. So I cite those three examples: education, economic opportunities or lack thereof, and the heroin and opioid crisis, to show that there are stark similarities between each of these communities that are dealing with urban poverty and rural poverty. Even though folks may look different, the terrain may be different, we're all in this together. So I would submit to you that at the end of the day, yes, I believe that if our investigation uncovers that there are systemic racism at some of these major institutions that are holding people back by not giving them access to capital, that's not a Philadelphia problem. That is a Pennsylvania problem that is going to impact communities well beyond the city of Philadelphia, and we're going to do something about it.
Finally, let me say, Attorney General Shapiro and to Congressman Evans, and listen, Ward and people in the community, rest assured, are going to be extremely pleased to know that some of our best and brightest in the city of Philadelphia, particularly given the high number of institutions of higher learning that we have here, you're using your intellectual prowess to help inform this conversation. But I want to just humbly ask Attorney General that when we look at this issue, and Peter Schneider from CLS will be testifying later, not only is there an issue with people who are denied mortgages, but when they are denied mortgages, they are being moved into the direction of engaging in predatory rent-to-own agreements, or lease agreements. They have like a lot of sexy names, and Peter's going to go through all of them. And we know that your office, the Division of Consumer Protection, we know they know it and you are informed about it. I was just they had a town meeting last night, and the Consumer Protection Division of your office was at that town meeting, along with State Rep Isabella Fitzgerald and many others. So I want to commend each of you for your work. Congressman Evans, you mentioned community development, block grant funding. You know, that has long been an issue of grave concern, particularly relative to neighborhood stabilization. So we know that you'll keep us informed on that, and any way that we can add value in that federal, state, local, intergovernmental sort of cooperative planning agreement or workforce that you talked about. Be pleased to work with my colleague along with other members to move that forward. So thank you all so very much.
I do want to say, Mr. Attorney General, as you do your statewide research, I would like to see the comparison of loans that are made in suburban counties versus compared to loans that are made in urban communities, to see is there a disparity, and if there's a statewide issue from that aspect. But that would be very interesting, because I looked at part of the Reveal report from the Center for Investigative Reporting. We had one young lady, African American, who credit was good. I think she had one small blemish, and they took her through the hoops, and then she had a partner, right, who was Caucasian, who really didn't didn't make a significant amount of money. And this is all documented, and she just got her to go in and get the loan, and she got the loan with no problem at all. And so it would be interesting to see what they'll look like on a statewide level. But I thank you for your leadership, stepping up to the plate and getting down to it. Councilman Blondell Reynolds-Brown.
Good morning. I would be remiss not to echo the observation made by Congressman Evans, and I've been here reflecting on what other issue has risen to this place on the radar screen where you indeed are talking, or we're talking about a coalition at the federal level, the state level, the city level, backed up with the research provided by academia. And in my reflection here, I cannot think of one issue, Mr. Chairman, where all levels of government are coming together to say, A, this is wrong, and B, this is wrong, and C, this is wrong. And so it is going to require collective intellect and just commitment to fix this ugly issue. So I thank you for stepping away from your busy lives to be a part of this chorus that we have to keep elevated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Watcher, you talked about in your testimony, redline neighborhoods are still suffering the consequences of the policies from the past. Can you speak to the differing experience of neighborhoods that remain disinvested and those that have recently received significant investment, such as Center City and the surrounding neighborhoods? And then the second component to my question is, you also testified that the minimum credit scores required by lenders have over time risen. Are you referencing the tightening of the loan criteria as a result of the recent mortgage crisis that we had in 2008?
Yes, thank you. I'd be pleased to address both of your questions. The first question is, what were the outcomes historically? We have evidence for the nation as a whole, for major cities, and Philadelphia is included in that, which indicates that previously redlined areas decades ago still have lower investment today, less housing supply, and lower housing prices. And that's taking into consideration all other factors. So it's isolating, identifying the impact of redlining alone, redlining in itself, which is astonishing, actually, because it's saying that the fate of people, the fate of neighborhoods is in the hands of arbitrary lending decisions that were race-based. And it is incumbent upon us today to make sure that going forward we can say this is no longer the case, and quite the contrary, that we have equal and fair access to opportunity and to home ownership. It's particularly important today because the city of Philadelphia is doing well, thanks to the leadership of many in the city council and private sector as well. It's prospering. But what's critical is shared prosperity. And home ownership and access to home ownership, I would say, is the most important factor for access to continued opportunity for housing, opportunity for jobs, opportunity to remain with friends and family in the city as it prospers for all. And I'm sorry, your second question?
You talked about the minimum credit scores required by
Yes.
lenders
Thank you very much.
and how they have risen over time.
Yes. In response to the subprime crisis, which, if you allow me, I will underline that it was absolutely not lending to minority communities or low-income communities that led to the crisis. Quite the contrary. So it wasn't the affirmative lending of the Community Reinvestment Act that led to the crisis. This is entirely orthogonal to entirely unrelated. However, communities of color were harmed by the aftermath of the crisis. They were not responsible for the crisis, but they were harmed by the crisis and its aftermath. Critical to the ongoing harm is...
Can you elaborate how?
Yes, I will. Lenders, in perhaps an understandable boomerang, have stepped back from lending across the country. And I'm speaking specifically for conventional prime lending. And they've stepped back, and in some cases they've withdrawn from FHA lending as well, in part because they were penalized, and from their perspective, unfairly so. That's a separate conversation. But in any case, it's their decision whether to lend or not. And they have raised the credit standards, the credit quality standards, and the credit score specifically standards to levels far beyond what they were. I'm not speaking about what they were going into the crisis, because we did have too loose lending standards then. They have raised their lending standards far beyond what they were historically, far beyond what they were in 2000, far beyond very safe levels. So I am very much endorse and think it's critically important for us to investigate what is the role today of lending practices, not just in the City of Philadelphia, but City of Philadelphia is on the front lines of this, because home ownership rates have fallen directly among minority communities due to these practices.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you for your testimony.